Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bullpen. In the Bullpen today, we have Mr. John Hartley. He's a writer, economic researcher, and commentator with Young Voices. He has been a regular contributor for Forbes and the Huffington Post. His writings have also appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times. We will not hold that against him here.
Thanks so much for having me.
How are you, sir?
Very well. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for being on the show. All right, we're gonna chop it up about Russia sanctions and inflation in the United States as a result. Obviously, there's some connection there. I don't want to presume what you know or believe about this topic. So if you would, give us your sentiment and I will opine.
Absolutely. So what's transpired over the past month is with Russia invading Ukraine is the largest European invasion since World War II. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's something that's been completely unprovoked. It is really just a humanitarian, the most significant humanitarian concern I think in quite some time. This was something that I think is ultimately a test of democratic alliances around the world in terms of what the appropriate response is. I think the U.S. and its allies need to stand together and punish Russia, with sanctions as things continue to escalate. This involves cutting off Russia from SWIFT, which has already been done. It's involved freezing central bank reserves, something that's completely unprecedented. And furthermore, this also involves sanctioning particular Russian individuals or particular Russian government officials, including Vladimir Putin himself. And I think it ultimately also involves cutting off Russian oil imports, something which I think slowly even Europeans are warming up to. There will be economic repercussions, from these sorts of measures, things like even higher inflation. But I think an increasing number of surveys are indicating that I think people are willing to accept higher prices in order to punish Russia for these transgressions that have been committed, are continuing to be committed. There's millions of Ukrainian refugees who have now left Ukraine to neighboring countries, and I think as we've all seen from photos and videos from the past few weeks, it's nothing but a human catastrophe, one which is entirely preventable had Russia not began this incursion.
Right. I agree with your analysis. Your observation is spot on. So let me dive into a couple of things. You're an economics expert, so I'm going to contextualize this based on your expertise. When you create sanctions for a nation that is out of step with the broader world around it, you create those sanctions because you want to make their behavior unpopular with the citizens in that country. So basically the citizens are being punished by the sanctions. And the hope is that the citizens of that nation will turn against the leadership of that nation. And the leadership of that nation will give a damn about how the citizens feel about what they are doing. Now that requires significant assumption. And the assumption is, in order for sanctions to work, is that the leader or leaders who are involved in the behavior are concerned on a human level with those they are in charge of. Their leadership has an authority model, okay? And they care about their leadership. However, look at what's already happening. Russia's GDP is shrinking. You have businesses fleeing the area. You have a general shutdown of their ability to trade and to do commerce with the outside world. It's getting so bad that now they're trying to get money from China in order to keep their own economy going. They have proclamation after proclamation about utilizing their internal currency so that their internal currency retain some level of value. And then they have American propaganda, such as Tucker Carlson and others. What they're doing is playing this American opinion commentator over and over again as a loop on Russian TV by order of the Kremlin, according to a report that was leaked 2 weeks ago. My question to you is this: while these sanctions are devastating, unprecedented, quick, okay, nobody can argue that, will they be effective against a leader who may not care as much as you assume he cares about the people under his leadership?
Well, that's a fantastic point and fantastic question. I think it's really the $1 million question is will these sanctions, which are harsher than essentially any other sanctions that have been put in a place in history, harsher than sanctions against Iran, harsher than sanctions against Venezuela, but both of these in recent memory, will it really result in either regime change or deterrence? And I think it's still unclear. To your point, it is possible that Russia could turn to using things like the SIP's Chinese message payment system, which is an alternative to SWIFT. They've worked on developing their own SPFS system. So it is possible that Russia could try to adapt to some of these things. I think to your point, the toll of the sanctions is so great already, with so many businesses pulling out, the Russian ruble being massively devalued, Russian stocks taking massive hits. I think it's such an enormous toll that's occurred. I think there's no debating that, but whether it translates into meaningful change in terms of deterring further military aggression, I think is very difficult to know. It's obviously it's a fine line with also considering military support or military action. There's obviously been a wide range of military supplies that have been provided. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not to provide MiG aircraft from neighboring countries, and whether that could be done through the United States. And then there's I think other things that have been surprising too, like Turkish manufactured drones that Ukraine has been using fairly effectively, and I think a number of these surprises alongside, I think, just the Ukrainian the resolve of the Ukrainians to fight for their own liberty and freedom has been so strong that it's turned what at one point people were expecting to be an invasion that would just last a few days, resulting in the Russian capture of Ukraine, to a very long incursion now being nearly a month out. And so I think I wish I could give you a perfect answer, but I think this is really what everyone's wondering. Will these sanctions and will the resolve of the Ukrainian military, which has been effective at fighting the Russian military so far, will that cause Putin to go and after some sort of a plan B, or perhaps reach some sort of a peace deal of some sort?
Or maybe the other option is that somebody in Putin's camp, they have enough love for Russia and Russian people that they decide to do a power grab and take Vladimir Putin out of the leadership of Russia in order to save Russia. I think that is a distinct possibility as well at some point moving forward. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's I think that's probably a very difficult thing to forecast. He's, I think, a very reclusive type of figure. He famously is sitting at the end of these very long tables, and even someone sitting across from him at a table would find it very difficult to even get a few feet away from him. So I think and he's also fairly reclusive in terms of where he physically operates.
Do you think he's a genius, as Donald Trump said? Do you think he's somebody that is a genius at his understanding of the world and his systematic approach to invading Ukraine?
No, not at all. I think he's made a massive mistake. I think in terms of he's made a massive miscalculation. One in terms of how quickly he would take Ukrainian land, and clearly it's panned out to be much longer than he initially anticipated. There's been a whole sorts of ordeals that the Russian soldiers have been dealing with in terms of supplies, staying fed and so forth. So I think this has certainly not turned out to be what what Vladimir Putin had originally anticipated. And so I think the question is, now that we're here, what happens now?
Yeah.
And this is not a figure that really wants to concede defeat, and will try and find the path that is most favorable to his own grand ideals of trying to create some sort of a return to USSR type vision that I think he's trying to leave as his legacy. But I think you see the amount of unrest within Russia. I think the entire I think by and large the entire democratic world, the free world is very upset about this. And I think just the human toll of maternity wards being bombed, the massive amounts of casualties, especially on the part of women, children, unarmed civilians, is so tragic that I don't think that any sane person would want to.
And I agree with you on all of that. I'm anti-war personally. I do not believe war is simply an expression of the human condition. I think we've been indoctrinated to believe that. Let me bring some things to your attention that I think these stats are fascinating because it shows you the spirit inside of people who are still very for democracy and governments not being assaulted in this way. So a recent poll was done and it shows that 87% of Americans are saying this is squarely the fault of Vladimir Putin, 87%. That's important because we are in such a polarizing political culture right now that it's very difficult to get damn near 90% of Americans to agree on anything, especially when you have contrarians who are simply putting out misinformation and being apologists for Vladimir Putin. Another stat that I found interesting is the reality that across the board, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, the majority of them actually support enhancing the sanctions, even at the detriment or the inconvenience of themselves in order to protect democracy abroad. I found that to be an interesting dynamic. There are those on the right who are saying, well, if Trump would have been president, this would not have happened. I actually think this happened in part because Trump was president. I think Trump made Vladimir Putin feel comfortable. And I think he miscalculated, just as you said. I think he made a mass miscalculation because if he's a genius, he knows how the international community would have responded to this. But I do believe he felt comfortable, so comfortable that he did not have a financial plan for his country. He had a military plan, but it doesn't seem that he had a financial plan for his country. Now he's trying to borrow money from China. What are your thoughts to that sentiment?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it is true that if you look at prior to the Ukrainian incursion, you look at past instances where Russia has taken some land grabs. That there was 2008 in South Ossetia, there was Crimea, and that was during the President George W. Bush administration. There was the Crimea 2014 incursion. which is during the Obama administration, and now you have what's going on now. I think when you think about it, I think things like the airstrike on Qasem Soleimani, was something that was very unpredicted, and those sorts of things I think that are something perhaps that could deter somebody like a Putin from attacking Ukraine, say during President Trump, during the time when Donald Trump was president, in the sense that he's sort of an unknown commodity, in the sense that you don't necessarily know what President Trump's then retaliatory plan might have been. Whereas one thing that I do find a bit surprising in a lot of the response now is really just how clearly the U.S. and other Western allies are communicating in response to for example nuclear threats and so forth, that they're making it very clear that things like no-fly zones are off the table, and do
you agree with that personally? Do you agree that no-fly zones should be off the table, or do you see a world where a no-fly zone would potentially be a game changer here and not create World War III? Because if they enact a no-fly zone and Russia violates it, which they will, that means you have to now enforce the no-fly zone by shooting one of their planes out of the sky. You have now entered into the war.
Right. So I personally, I totally understand the risks of escalating the current situation, and you don't want U.S. or Western jets to be firing or coming into contact with Russian jets. The point I'm just trying to make is, I just don't think that it's a good strategy to project that zone is off the table.
I think I see where you're going. You're saying the front-leaning narrative should have left that on the table, at least in expression, rather than revealing a strategy that you will not do this basically under any circumstance. You're saying, keep them guessing. Say it may be an option.
Right? Guessing. Rather than, because what I think the current strategy does with giving a very clear idea of what the U.S. and Western response will be is basically like rolling out red carpet, and for Putin to just come into Ukraine and knowing that there will certainly be very few military consequences directly from the U.S. So trying to keep them guessing is sort of the idea behind deterrence, and so deterrence is something that we've effectively now seemingly lost with this strategy.
John Hartley, I'm out of time, but I appreciate you being on the program. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Richey.
Absolutely.